Danny Kim had been walking dogs in Central Galactic Park for 3 years, and he'd learned that every species had their own quirks when it came to pet care. Rigelian crystalline hounds needed their facets polished daily to maintain proper light, refraction. Andromedan vapor cats required specialized containment fields during their gaseous phases, and Zephyrian flutterwings had to be exercised in carefully controlled atmospheric pressure chambers. But the client who contacted Danny's pet care service on a quiet Tuesday morning was different from any he'd encountered before. The message came through standard interstellar communication channels, but the content was unlike typical service requests. Human dog walker, I require ambulatory assistance for my companion entity. Standard pet care protocols have proven ... inadequate for our specific requirements. The message was signed simply Yonder, with coordinates for a meeting location in the park's restricted research sector, an area Danny had never been authorized to enter. When Danny arrived at the designated coordinates, he found himself face to face with a being unlike any he'd seen in his years of working with diverse galactic species. Yonder stood 7 feet tall, with translucent skin that seemed to contain swirling galaxies of light, and 4 arms that moved with the fluid grace of someone perpetually reaching for something just beyond grasp. Human Danny Kim, Yonder announced, in a voice that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. You have been recommended as someone who approaches pet care with unconventional methodology. Danny looked around the restricted area, noting the high security barriers and warning signs about authorized personnel only. Yonder, I appreciate the recommendation, but I'm not sure I'm supposed to be in this sector. Are you authorized to hire civilian pet care services here? Yonder's translucent features shifted in patterns that Danny couldn't interpret, but seemed to indicate some form of internal conflict. Authorization is complicated in our situation. My companion entity has requirements that fall outside standard pet care classifications. What kind of requirements? Instead of answering directly, Yonder led Danny to a large, heavily secured enclosure that looked more like a scientific containment facility than a pet habitat. Inside, Danny saw what appeared to be a small creature about the size of a medium dog, but with features that defied easy categorization. The entity had the basic body structure of a quadruped, but its limbs seemed to phase in and out of different dimensional states. Its fur shifted colors and patterns that reminded Danny of Aurora Borealis, and most remarkably, it appeared to be existing in several slightly different physical states simultaneously. This is Cosmos, Yonder announced with obvious affection. My life companion and the most important being in my existence. Danny approached the enclosure carefully, noting that standard safety protocols seemed inadequate for whatever Cosmos actually was. Yonder, I've worked with a lot of unusual pets, but I've never seen anything like Cosmos. What species is he? That question involves complexities that most beings find difficult to process. Danny waited for further explanation, but Yonder seemed reluctant to continue. Human Danny, may I ask why you chose pet care as your profession? The question caught Danny off guard. I chose dog walking because I love animals, and I believe every creature deserves exercise, attention, and care, regardless of how unusual they might be. Yonder's translucent features shifted to patterns that seemed to indicate surprise, mixed with something that might have been hope. Regardless of how unusual, I've walked crystalline hounds that sing in harmonics that can shatter, glass vapor cats that exist in 3 states of matter simultaneously, and flutterwings that can only be seen in infrared light. Unusual doesn't scare me, but Cosmos is not unusual in the way other pets are unusual. Cosmos, eyes unprecedented. Danny studied the creature, who seemed to be aware of their conversation and was moving in patterns that suggested intelligence far beyond typical pet behavior. Yonder, what makes Cosmos unprecedented? Yonder was quiet for several minutes, his 4 arms moving in complex gestures that seemed to be part of some internal decision-making process. Human Danny, Cosmos exists in multiple dimensional states simultaneously. He is not just a pet, he is a being whose existence challenges fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality itself. Danny looked at Cosmos with growing fascination rather than concern. So he needs specialized care because of his dimensional nature. He needs specialized care because he is currently classified as a research specimen rather than a companion animal, and the research protocols are causing him psychological trauma. The statement hit Danny like a physical blow as he realized what Yonder was actually asking. You're not looking for a dog walker. You're looking for someone to help you rescue Cosmos from a research facility. I am looking for someone who will treat Cosmos as the sentient companion he is, rather than as the experimental subject the Galactic Research Authority has classified him as. Danny looked around the heavily secured area, understanding now why they were meeting in a restricted sector and why authorization was complicated. Yonder, are you a researcher here? I am the lead dimensional physicist assigned to study Cosmos's unique properties, but I am also the being who has spent 2 years caring for him, communicating with him, and developing an emotional bond that the research authority considers ... unprofessional. And they want to continue studying him despite your objections? Yonder's translucent form seemed to dim as he processed emotions that Danny was learning to recognize as deep sadness and frustration. The research authority has classified Cosmos as the most significant scientific discovery in galactic history. They believe his dimensional properties could revolutionize transportation, communication, and energy production throughout the known universe. But you think they're wrong? I think they are so focused on what Cosmos might teach us about physics that they have forgotten he is a living being with emotional needs, social requirements, and the right to companionship rather than isolation. Danny approached the enclosure more closely, noting that Cosmos seemed to respond to his presence with what appeared to be curiosity and hope. Yonder, what exactly are you asking me to do? I am asking you to provide Cosmos with the same care you would give any other companion animal: exercise, social interaction, emotional support, and the opportunity to experience life beyond laboratory walls, even though he's classified as a research specimen, especially because he's classified as a research specimen. The research authority's protocols treat him as an object to be studied rather than a being to be cared for. Danny realized that Yonder was asking him to become involved in what could be considered theft of valuable research property, or alternatively, liberation of a sentient being from unlawful imprisonment. Yonder, if I help you with Cosmos's care, what are the potential consequences? For you, potentially serious legal complications with galactic research authorities. For me, career termination and possible criminal charges for unauthorized emotional attachment to research subjects. And for Cosmos? For Cosmos, the possibility of experiencing life as a companion rather than an experiment. Danny looked at the dimensional creature, who seemed to exist in several slightly different versions of reality simultaneously, and realized that his simple pet-walking business was about to become involved in a case that could reshape galactic law regarding the rights of unique sentient beings. Yonder, I need to understand something. When you say Cosmos has emotional needs and social requirements, how do you know that? How do you communicate with a being that exists in multiple dimensions? The same way you communicate with any intelligent creature, through patience, observation, and genuine care for their well-being. Yonder activated a holographic interface that showed complex data about Cosmos's behavior patterns, stress indicators, and interaction responses. These readings show Cosmos's psychological state during standard research procedures versus his state during our informal companionship sessions. The difference is as clear as the data you would see comparing a caged animal to one receiving proper care and attention. Danny studied the data, recognizing patterns that any experienced pet caretaker would identify as the difference between a distressed animal and a content one. So you're asking me to help prove that Cosmos deserves to be treated as a companion rather than property? I am asking you to help demonstrate that some discoveries are too important to be locked away in laboratories. They need to be shared with communities that can appreciate them for what they are, rather than just what they might teach us. As Danny agreed to meet Cosmos and assess his care needs, he realized that his simple desire to help unusual pets exercise and socialize was about to challenge fundamental assumptions about the relationship between scientific research and individual rights throughout the galaxy. The first time Danny actually walked Cosmos, he discovered that walking a multidimensional being required skills no pet care training had prepared him for. Cosmos didn't just move through space. He moved through several versions of space simultaneously, occasionally phasing into dimensional states where Danny could only track him by the aurora-like light patterns that marked his presence. "Cosmos, stay in this dimension, please," Danny called out, as the creature began to fade into what Yonder had explained was a parallel reality phase. To Danny's amazement, Cosmos solidified back into their shared dimensional space, looking at Danny with eyes that seemed to contain entire universes of intelligence and something that could only be described as gratitude. "How did you know he would respond to that?" Yonder asked, monitoring their exercise session through dimensional tracking equipment. "Same way I know when any dog is getting distracted or wandering off. Use a firm but friendly voice and clear direction." Cosmos might exist in multiple dimensions, but he still responds to consistent communication. Over the following weeks, Danny developed walking techniques that accommodated Cosmos's unique nature while treating him with the same care and attention he provided to all his clients. But the more time he spent with the dimensional creature, the more he began to understand the ethical complexities of the situation. Cosmos wasn't just intelligent, he was emotionally sophisticated, socially aware, and capable of forming deep bonds with the beings who cared for him. When research protocols required him to be isolated for testing, he exhibited clear signs of depression and anxiety. When Danny and Yonder spent time with him, providing companionship and normal social interaction, he thrived. "The research authority is scheduling increased testing protocols next week," Yonder informed Danny during one of their sessions. "They want to study his dimensional shifting abilities under stress conditions." Danny paused in his play session with Cosmos, who had been happily phasing between dimensions while chasing what appeared to be interdimensional butterflies. "What kind of stress conditions?" "Isolation chambers, sensory deprivation, forced dimensional shifting while preventing his return to stable states. They believe stress responses will reveal more about his capabilities." Danny felt anger rising as he processed what Yonder was describing. They want to torture him to see how his abilities work under trauma. They call it controlled adverse stimulus testing to optimize understanding of dimensional phase transition mechanics. That's torture with scientific terminology. Yonder's translucent form shifted to darker patterns that Danny had learned, indicated profound distress. "Human Danny, I must confess something that complicates our situation further." "What kind of complication?" "I have not been entirely truthful about my position within the research authority." Danny felt his stomach sink as he realized their rescue operation might be more complex than he'd understood. "Yonder, what haven't you told me? I am not just the lead researcher assigned to study Cosmos. I am the being who discovered him and brought him to the research authority's attention." A revelation hit Danny like a physical blow as he processed the implications of what Yonder was admitting. "You discovered Cosmos? Where?" "On a desolate planet in the Outer Rim, alone, and apparently injured from some kind of dimensional accident that stranded him in our reality." "So you rescued him initially?" "I believed I was rescuing him. I brought him to the research authority because I thought they could help him recover and possibly find a way to return him to his home dimension." Danny looked at Cosmos, who seemed to sense the tension in their conversation and had moved closer, as if seeking comfort from the beings he'd learned to trust. But they decided to keep him for research instead of helping him. They decided that his unique properties made him too valuable to scientific advancement to risk losing through attempted repatriation. "So now you're trying to fix a mistake you made 2 years ago?" Yonder's form seemed to collapse inward as he processed the weight of his actions and their consequences. "Human Danny, I brought Cosmos to the research authority, believing they would prioritize his well-being while studying his abilities. Instead, they have prioritized his utility while treating his well-being as irrelevant." "And you didn't realize this would happen?" "I am a dimensional physicist who had never encountered a being like Cosmos. I made assumptions about institutional ethics that proved to be ... naive." Danny continued playing with Cosmos while processing this new information about the moral complexities they were facing. "Yonder, what changed your mind about the research authority's approach?" "Spending time caring for Cosmos as an individual rather than studying him as a phenomenon. The moment I began to see him as a being with personality, preferences, and emotional needs, I could no longer justify treating him as research property. So you developed an emotional attachment that the research authority considers unprofessional? I developed a relationship with a sentient being who deserves companionship and care, not isolation and experimentation. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Security Chief Vextal, whose imposing presence and official credentials immediately shifted the dynamic of their gathering. Researcher Yonder, you are in violation of Protocol 7 Alpha regarding unauthorized interaction with classified research subjects. Danny felt the situation escalating beyond the informal pet care arrangement he thought he'd been providing. Security Chief Vextal, I am conducting necessary behavioral analysis that requires extended observation periods. Researcher Yonder, your behavioral analysis does not require civilian pet care providers or recreational activities outside controlled laboratory environments. Security Chief Vextal turned his attention to Danny with a kind of official scrutiny that suggested serious legal implications. Human Danny Kim, you are in violation of Galactic Research Security protocols by providing unauthorized services to classified experimental subjects. Security Chief, I was hired to provide pet care services to what I was told was a unique companion animal requiring specialized attention. Human Danny Kim, Entity Cosmos is classified as Research Subject 7 Alpha, not as a companion animal. Your services are unauthorized and potentially compromising to ongoing scientific investigation. Danny realized that their informal arrangement was about to become a formal legal confrontation that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. Security Chief Vextal, may I ask what specific research protocols are being compromised by allowing Cosmos to exercise and receive social interaction? Human Danny Kim, Research Subject 7 Alpha's behavioral patterns must remain uncontaminated by external social influences to ensure accurate measurement of baseline psychological and dimensional response characteristics. So you need to keep him isolated to study how isolation affects his abilities. We need to maintain controlled environmental conditions to ensure research data accuracy. Danny looked at Cosmos, who seemed to understand that the conversation was about his future and was displaying what any experienced pet caretaker would recognize as anxiety and fear. Security Chief, what if I could demonstrate that social interaction actually enhances rather than compromises Cosmos's dimensional abilities? Explain your hypothesis, Human Danny Kim. Give me 1 week to document how Cosmos's dimensional shifting, problem-solving, and overall capabilities change when he receives proper care and social interaction versus when he's isolated for research. Security Chief Vextal consulted his authorization protocols while Yonder watched with expressions of hope mixed with concern about the risks Danny was taking. Human Danny Kim, unauthorized experimentation on classified research subjects carries severe legal penalties. Security Chief, I'm not proposing unauthorized experimentation. I'm proposing documented pet care that could provide valuable data about how environmental factors affect Cosmos's abilities. And if your hypothesis proves incorrect, Danny looked at Cosmos, whose multidimensional existence had brought him to their attention, but whose emotional needs had made him Danny's responsibility. Then you'll have data proving that isolation is the optimal environment for studying his capabilities. But if my hypothesis is correct, you'll discover that treating Cosmos as a companion rather than property actually enhances the scientific understanding you're seeking. As Security Chief Vextal authorized a 1-week trial period for Danny's approach, all three beings realized that the next 7 days would determine not just Cosmos's future, but the precedent for how the galaxy treated sentient beings whose uniqueness made them valuable to scientific research. The experimental week that Security Chief Vextal had authorized turned into the most intensive pet care project of Danny's career, but also the most revelatory study of interspecies communication he'd ever witnessed. Working with Yonder to document Cosmos's responses to proper care versus isolation, Danny discovered that multidimensional beings apparently had the same emotional needs as any other intelligent creature. They just expressed them in ways that required more careful observation. Look at these dimensional coherence readings, Yonder announced during their 3rd day of documented interaction. When Cosmos receives social attention and physical exercise, His dimensional shifting becomes more controlled and purposeful rather than random and stress-driven. Danny was playing a modified version of Fetch with Cosmos, using toys that could exist in multiple dimensional states, so that Cosmos could interact with them during his phase transitions. It makes sense when you think about it. Happy, well-exercised pets have better behavioral control than stressed, isolated ones. Why would that be different just because Cosmos exists in multiple dimensions? Because the research authority assumed that his dimensional abilities were purely physical phenomena, unaffected by psychological states. But you're discovering that his emotional well-being directly impacts his dimensional control? More than that, his dimensional abilities appear to be enhanced by positive social interaction and diminished by isolation stress. Danny watched Cosmos successfully retrieve a toy from what appeared to be a parallel dimension, bringing it back to their shared reality with the pride of any dog who'd completed a successful fetch command. Yonder, I need to ask you something personal. When you first discovered Cosmos, what made you think he needed help rather than just study? Yonder paused in his data recording, his translucent form shifting to the softer patterns Danny had learned indicated emotional reflection. He was attempting to care for what appeared to be an injured smaller version of himself, perhaps offspring, perhaps a companion. When I approached, he positioned himself protectively, despite being obviously weak and disoriented. So, your first observation was that he demonstrated caring behavior toward another being? My first observation was that he prioritized another's well-being over his own safety when confronted by an unknown entity. Danny continued playing with Cosmos while processing the implications of what Yonder was describing. What happened to the other being he was protecting? It had died before I arrived, but Cosmos was still trying to share his dimensional energy to revive it. He nearly killed himself attempting to save a being that was already beyond help. So he's capable of self-sacrifice for others? He is capable of love in ways that transcend species boundaries or dimensional limitations. Danny realized that Cosmos's story was far more complex than a simple rescue scenario. Was about a being who had lost someone important and been taken from his familiar environment during a time of grief. Yonder, has anyone ever considered that Cosmos might be mourning? That his stress responses might be grief-related rather than just reaction to laboratory conditions? The question seemed to hit Yonder like a revelation, his form shifting to patterns of intense processing, mixed with what appeared to be professional embarrassment. Human Danny, the research authority's psychological assessments, focused on his dimensional abilities and responses to various stimuli. No one considered the possibility that he might be experiencing loss-related emotional trauma. So for 2 years, everyone has been treating him like a fascinating specimen, while he's been mourning the loss of someone important to him, isolated from any kind of emotional support. That assessment appears accurate and deeply troubling. Danny sat down in the park, and Cosmos immediately moved to lean against him, seeking physical comfort in the way that any grieving creature might seek the presence of someone who cared about their well-being. Cosmos, you miss someone, don't you? Danny said gently, running his hand through the creature's dimension-shifting fur dot to everyone's surprise. Cosmos responded by projecting what appeared to be holographic images from his dimensional abilities, showing scenes of himself with another being similar to him, playing, resting together, and sharing what looked like food or energy. He's showing us memories, Yonder whispered with amazement. The holographic projections continued, showing what was clearly a bonded relationship between Cosmos and the other being, until the images shifted to scenes of injury, distress, and, finally, the loss that had left Cosmos alone and displaced from his home dimension. Oh, Cosmos, Danny said softly, understanding now why the creature had responded so strongly to consistent care and companionship. You haven't just been isolated for research. You've been isolated while grieving. Cosmos's projections shifted to scenes of his time with Danny and Yonder walking in the park, playing games, receiving attention and affection. The difference in his demeanor between the grief memories and the recent companionship was striking. Human, Danny, this changes everything about how we understand Cosmos's psychological state and needs. It also changes everything about the ethical implications of keeping him isolated for research. Their discussion was interrupted by the unexpected arrival of Dr. Kelleron, the chief research director, whose presence indicated that their experimental week had attracted high-level attention. Researcher yonder, human Danny Kim, I have been monitoring your behavioral research with great interest. Danny felt the familiar tension of official scrutiny, but also recognized an opportunity to present their findings to someone with authority to make decisions about Cosmos's future. Dr. Kelleron, we've discovered that Cosmos's dimensional abilities are significantly enhanced by proper emotional support and social interaction. I have reviewed your data, and the correlations are indeed compelling. However, I must address some concerns about your methodology. What kind of concerns? Dr. Kelleron activated a holographic display showing comparative analysis of Cosmos's abilities under different conditions. Your research demonstrates that entity Cosmos performs better in social environments, but it also suggests that his emotional attachment to caregivers could compromise the objectivity of future research. Danny realized that Dr. Kelleron was identifying the same unprofessional attachment issue that had initially gotten Yonder in trouble. Dr. Kelleron, what if emotional attachment isn't a compromise to research objectivity, but rather a necessary condition for understanding how his abilities actually function? Explain your reasoning, human Danny Kim. Cosmos's dimensional abilities seem to be connected to his emotional state and social bonds. If you isolate him from those bonds, you're not studying his natural capabilities, you're studying his trauma responses. Dr. Kelleron consulted additional data while processing this perspective on research methodology. You are suggesting that our current research protocols have been measuring Cosmos's stress responses rather than his actual abilities. I'm suggesting that you can't understand what someone is capable of by studying them under conditions that prevent them from functioning at their best. Yonder stepped forward with supporting data that strengthened Danny's argument. Dr. Kelleron, Cosmos's dimensional control, problem-solving abilities, and communication skills all show marked improvement when he receives proper emotional support. The research value of understanding his optimal performance exceeds the research value of documenting his responses to adverse conditions. Dr. Kelleron reviewed their findings while observing Cosmos, who was demonstrating his enhanced dimensional control by creating small, beautiful light patterns that seemed designed to entertain his human companions. Researcher yonder, human Danny Kim, you have presented compelling evidence that entity Cosmos requires social interaction and emotional support to function at optimal levels. Does that change how the research authority classifies his care requirements? It changes how we understand the relationship between his emotional needs and his scientific value. A being whose abilities are enhanced by proper care is more valuable to research when that care is provided than when it is withheld. Danny felt hope building as he realized that Dr. Kelleron might be reaching conclusions that supported Cosmos's well-being rather than just his research utility. Dr. Kelleron, what would proper care look like within research authority protocols? That question requires consideration of options that fall outside our current institutional frameworks. As Dr. Kelleron continued to review their data, all three beings realized that their week-long experiment had produced evidence that could fundamentally change how the galaxy approached research involving sentient subjects whose uniqueness made them valuable to science. The breakthrough that changed everything came during Danny's second week with Cosmos. When the multidimensional being did something that no one had expected, he began teaching Danny to perceive reality across dimensional boundaries. It started during a routine walk when Cosmos suddenly stopped phasing and looked directly at Danny with an expression of intense concentration. Before Danny could ask what was wrong, he began to see overlapping versions of the park around them, the same space existing in slightly different dimensional states simultaneously. Danny, are you experiencing dimensional perception expansion? Yonder asked urgently, noting the readings from his monitoring equipment. I'm seeing multiple versions of everything. Like the park exists in several similar but different realities at the same time. That should be impossible for single-dimensional beings. Cosmos, what are you doing? Instead of answering Yonder directly, Cosmos began projecting more complex holographic communications. showing images of himself sharing dimensional perception with the companion he had lost, suggesting that this was a natural form of bonding behavior for his species. He's trying to include me in his dimensional experience, Danny realized, like he used to do with his partner. Human Danny, this represents an unprecedented development in interspecies communication. No single-dimensional being has ever achieved shared perception across dimensional boundaries. But their excitement was complicated by the arrival of Dr. Kelleron, accompanied by a full research team, whose presence indicated that Cosmos's new behavior had triggered high-level scientific interest. Human Danny Kim, you are experiencing unprecedented neurological changes as a result of exposure to Entity Cosmos's dimensional abilities. Danny found himself caught between the wonder of perceiving reality from Cosmos's multidimensional perspective and concern about what the research team's sudden interest might mean for his and Cosmos's future. Dr. Kelleron, the changes don't feel dangerous. They feel like Cosmos is sharing his way of experiencing the world. Human Danny Kim, you are the first single-dimensional being to achieve cross-dimensional perception. The scientific implications are extraordinary, but what does that mean for Cosmos? And what does it mean for me? Dr. Kelleron activated holographic displays showing brain scans and dimensional energy readings that Danny couldn't interpret, but clearly indicated significant changes in his neurological functioning. It means that Entity Cosmos has demonstrated abilities we never suspected, the capacity to enhance other beings' perceptual capabilities and form bonds that transcend dimensional boundaries. Yonder stepped forward with expressions of concern, mixed with professional fascination. Dr. Kelleron, does this development change Cosmos's research status? It changes everything about how we understand his capabilities, his social needs, and his potential value to galactic communication and exploration. Danny felt a sinking sensation as he realized that his enhanced perception might have made both him and Cosmos more valuable as research subjects rather than less. Dr. Kelleron, I need to understand what you're proposing. Are you planning to study how Cosmos's abilities affect me, or are you planning to study how I can use the abilities he's shared with me? Human Danny Kim, the research authority is facing an unprecedented situation. We have a being whose bonding behaviors can enhance other species capabilities in ways that could revolutionize galactic exploration and communication. So you want to expand the research to include me as a subject? We want to understand how to safely replicate the dimensional perception sharing that Entity Cosmos has spontaneously initiated with you. Yonder was reviewing the research data with growing alarm about the implications for both Danny's and Cosmos's autonomy. Dr. Kelleron, replicating the bonding process would require understanding the emotional and social factors that enabled it to occur naturally. Exactly, researcher Yonder. Which is why we need to study the relationship dynamics between human Danny Kim and Entity Cosmos in controlled laboratory conditions. Danny realized that their success in demonstrating Cosmos's need for social interaction had backfired by making the relationship itself a subject of scientific interest. Dr. Kelleron, what you're describing sounds like studying our friendship to figure out how to manufacture it artificially. We are proposing to study the mechanisms of interspecies dimensional bonding to understand how such relationships can be safely facilitated between multidimensional beings and other galactic species. But that would require separating me and Cosmos from our natural environment and subjecting our interactions to laboratory analysis. Dr. Kelleron consulted with a research team before responding to Danny's concerns about the implications of expanded study protocols. Human Danny Kim, the dimensional perception abilities you have developed represent the most significant advancement in interspecies communication in galactic history. The research authority has an obligation to understand and preserve these developments, preserve them or exploit them. Study them responsibly to ensure that the benefits can be safely extended to other beings while protecting both you and Entity Cosmos from any adverse effects. Danny looked at Cosmos, whose multidimensional form was shifting through patterns that seemed to indicate distress about the increasing focus on their relationship as a research phenomenon. Cosmos, how do you feel about them wanting to study our friendship? Cosmos responded by projecting holographic images showing laboratory environments isolation chambers, and being separated for individual analysis, clearly indicating that he understood and opposed what was being proposed. He doesn't want to be separated from me for research any more than he wanted to be isolated for study of his abilities. Yonder was documenting Cosmos's communication attempts while processing the ethical implications of the situation. Dr. Kelleron, entity Cosmos is clearly expressing preferences about his treatment and relationships. How does his consent factor into research protocols? Researcher Yonder. Consent protocols for unique research subjects are complex. Entity Cosmos's unprecedented nature places him outside standard ethical frameworks. Danny felt anger building as he realized that Cosmos's uniqueness was being used to justify ignoring his clearly expressed preferences about his own treatment. Dr. Kelleron, if Cosmos can communicate his desires clearly enough that we all understand he doesn't want to be separated from companionship for research, how is his uniqueness relevant to whether we should respect those desires? Human Danny Kim. The potential benefits of understanding dimensional bonding processes extend far beyond individual preferences. We must balance Entity Cosmos's comfort against galactic advancement in communication and exploration technologies. So, his individual rights are less important than his potential utility to galactic civilization. Dr. Kelleron was consulting her authorization protocols while processing the ethical challenges that Danny's questions were raising. Human Danny Kim. The research authority operates under mandates to advance scientific understanding for the benefit of all galactic species. Individual comfort cannot override those mandates when dealing with unprecedented discoveries. Danny realized that they had reached the core of the conflict between scientific advancement and individual rights that would determine both his and Cosmos's future. Dr. Kelleron, what if I refuse to participate in expanded research protocols? Human Danny Kim, your dimensional perception abilities make you a unique research asset. Refusal to participate would require evaluation of alternative approaches to studying the phenomena you represent. Alternative approaches? Like what? Dr. Kelleron's response was interrupted by an unexpected development. Cosmos suddenly expanded his dimensional sharing to include Yonder and several members of the research team, creating a group perception experience that none of them had anticipated. Suddenly, everyone present was experiencing reality from Cosmos's multidimensional perspective, seeing the park and each other as they existed across several dimensional states simultaneously. What is he doing? Dr. Kelleron asked, her voice filled with wonder and concern as she processed the unprecedented sensory experience. I think he's showing us that his abilities aren't just about individual bonding, Danny realized. He can facilitate group communication across dimensional boundaries. Cosmos's holographic projections shifted to images of multiple beings sharing dimensional perception, working together, communicating in ways that transcended species and dimensional limitations, a vision of galactic cooperation that could only be achieved through the kind of voluntary bonding he had demonstrated. He's showing us the potential benefits of his abilities when they're shared freely rather than studied coercively. Yonder interpreted as the shared perception experience faded, leaving everyone with enhanced understanding of Cosmos's perspective and capabilities. Dr. Kelleron faced a decision that would shape the future of galactic research ethics and interspecies rights. The question was no longer just whether Cosmos deserved to be treated as a companion rather than property, but whether beings whose unique abilities could benefit all galactic civilization had the right to choose how those abilities were shared. The solution that transformed everything came not from scientific research or legal precedent, but from Danny's simple recognition that Cosmos needed the same thing every intelligent being needed, the right to choose his own relationships and how he shared his gifts with others. Dr. Kelleron, I want to propose something that might sound completely unprecedented, Danny announced during what had become daily meetings about Cosmos's future. What if instead of studying Cosmos to understand his abilities, we asked him to teach us? The research director paused in her review of dimensional bonding data to process what Danny was suggesting. Human Danny Kim, explain the distinction you are making between studying and teaching. When you study someone, you treat them as an object to be analyzed. When you learn from someone, you treat them as a person with knowledge to share. Yonder stepped forward with supporting observations from his months of working with Cosmos. Dr. Kelleran, Cosmos has consistently demonstrated preferences for voluntary interaction over imposed research. His abilities are enhanced when he chooses to share them rather than when they are extracted through testing protocols. But voluntary interaction lacks the controlled conditions necessary for reproducible scientific analysis. Dr. Kelleran protested. Dr. Kelleran, what if reproducible results aren't the goal? What if the goal is sustainable relationships that benefit everyone involved? Danny gestured toward Cosmos, who was demonstrating his dimensional abilities by creating beautiful, complex light patterns that seemed designed to bring joy to his observers rather than provide data for analysis. Look at what he's doing right now. He's not just showing us his abilities, he's sharing something beautiful because he wants to make us happy. That's not something you can reproduce in a laboratory. That's something that emerges from genuine care and voluntary connection. Dr. Kelleran was documenting Cosmos's artistic, dimensional displays while processing the philosophical implications of Danny's approach. Human Danny Kim, you are proposing that we abandon scientific methodology in favor of friendship? I'm proposing that we recognize that some of the most valuable discoveries come through relationship rather than research. Cosmos taught me dimensional perception, not because I was studying him, but because he wanted to share his experience with someone he trusted. Yonder activated holographic displays showing comparative data between Cosmos's responses to research protocols versus his responses to companionship and care. Dr. Kelleran, the evidence supports Danny's hypothesis. Cosmos's most significant abilities: dimensional sharing, enhanced communication, group bonding facilitation only emerge in nines contexts of voluntary trust and mutual care. So forcing study through research protocols actually prevents us from accessing the discoveries that relationship-based interaction makes possible. Danny continued. Dr. Kelleran was reviewing months of data while observing Cosmos's current behavior, which demonstrated more sophisticated abilities and communication than any laboratory testing had achieved. Human Danny Kim, you are suggesting that the research authority's methodology has been counterproductive to achieving our stated goals. I'm suggesting that treating Cosmos as property to be studied has prevented you from discovering what he can teach when treated as a partner in exploration. Cosmos seemed to understand their conversation and began projecting holographic images that showed potential applications of his abilities, facilitating communication between species that had previously been unable to understand each other, enabling exploration of dimensional spaces that had been inaccessible, creating collaborative opportunities that could benefit entire galactic communities. He's showing us what becomes possible when his abilities are shared voluntarily rather than extracted through coercion. Yonder interpreted. Dr. Kelleran was processing the implications of what Cosmos was demonstrating, that his greatest potential contributions to galactic civilization required him to be treated as an equal partner rather than a research subject. Colleagues, Entity Cosmos is proposing a paradigm that challenges fundamental assumptions about how scientific advancement occurs. Dr. Kelleran, maybe that's exactly what we need, a paradigm that recognizes that some discoveries can only happen through voluntary collaboration rather than imposed study. But how do we ensure that valuable knowledge is preserved and shared responsibly without formal research protocols? Danny looked at Cosmos, whose multidimensional existence had brought him to their attention, but whose capacity for voluntary teaching was revealing possibilities none of them had imagined. The same way knowledge has been preserved and shared throughout galactic history, through communities of beings who care about each other and want to help each other grow and learn. You are proposing that Cosmos become a teacher rather than a research subject? I'm proposing that Cosmos be given the choice about how he shares his abilities, with whom he forms relationships, and what contributions he wants to make to galactic understanding. Dr. Kelleran was consulting with the research authorities' highest levels of command while processing the unprecedented nature of what Danny was suggesting. Human Danny Kim, treating Entity Cosmos as an autonomous being with rights to self-determination would require fundamental changes in how the research authority approaches unique scientific phenomena. Dr. Kelleran, maybe fundamental changes are exactly what's needed when you encounter phenomena that challenge your existing approaches. Cosmos seemed to sense that a critical decision was approaching and began demonstrating his abilities in ways that clearly indicated his preferences. Showing images of himself, teaching voluntary students, facilitating communication between diverse species, and contributing to galactic exploration through collaborative partnerships rather than isolation research. He's telling us what kind of life he wants and what kind of contributions he wants to make, Danny observed. The question is whether we're going to listen to him or continue treating him like he doesn't have the right to choose his own path. Extensive consultation with research authority leadership, Dr. Kelleran returned with a decision that would reshape galactic approaches to scientific discovery and individual rights. Human Danny Kim, Entity Cosmos. Researcher Younger, the research authority, has authorized an unprecedented experimental protocol. What kind of experimental protocol? Entity Cosmos will be reclassified from research subject to collaborative partner with full autonomy over his participation in any research or educational activities. Danny felt relief and excitement building as he realized that Cosmos might finally be granted the rights and respect he deserved. What does collaborative partnership mean in practical terms? It means that Entity Cosmos will choose his own living arrangements, select his own companions and activities, and determine how and with whom he shares his abilities. The research authority will provide support and resources, but will not impose requirements or restrictions on his choices. Cosmos responded to this announcement by creating the most beautiful dimensional light display any of them had ever seen, patterns that seemed to express joy, gratitude, and hope for a future where his gifts could be shared freely rather than extracted coercively. But most importantly, Dr. Kelleran continued, this decision establishes a new precedent for how the galaxy will treat sentient beings, whose unique abilities make them valuable to scientific advancement. No being will be classified as research property simply because their capabilities are unprecedented. Danny realized that his simple desire to provide proper pet care had resulted in establishing galactic rights for sentient beings whose uniqueness had previously made them vulnerable to exploitation, disguised as scientific research. Dr. Kelleran, does this mean other beings in similar situations will have the same rights Cosmos is receiving? Human Danny Kim, this case establishes legal precedent that uniqueness does not eliminate personhood, and that the potential scientific value of studying someone does not override their right to autonomy and self-determination. As Cosmos began sharing his dimensional perception abilities with everyone present, not as a research demonstration, but as a gift of friendship and celebration, Danny understood that the most important scientific discoveries often emerged not from studying phenomena, but from building relationships with the beings who embodied them. 1 year after Cosmos was granted collaborative partner status, Danny found himself in the most unexpected role of his career, serving as Director of Interspecies Relationship, facilitation for what had become the Galactic Collaborative Learning Initiative. But what struck him most wasn't the institutional changes their success had created. It was watching Cosmos teach dimensional perception to a diverse group of voluntary students in the same park where they had first met. Students, dimensional. Sharing requires trust and genuine care for the well-being of those you're connecting with. Cosmos communicated through his holographic projections, which had evolved into sophisticated teaching tools. You cannot force dimensional perception. It emerges naturally from authentic relationship. Danny watched a class that included Rigelian researchers, Andromedan explorers, human scientists, and representatives from dozens of species learning, not just dimensional perception techniques, but collaborative approaches to discovery that prioritized mutual care over data extraction. Cosmos has developed teaching methodologies that produce better results than any research protocol we ever attempted, Yonder observed, documenting the learning outcomes from Cosmos's voluntary education programs. That's because he's not trying to transfer information. He's building relationships that make shared understanding possible. Danny replied, the transformation extended far beyond Cosmos's individual case. The legal precedent established by recognizing his autonomy had revolutionized how the galaxy approached scientific discovery involving sentient beings with unique abilities. Dr. Kelleran, who had evolved from research director to coordinator of collaborative scientific partnerships, was presenting data about the broader impacts of their relationship-based approach to discovery. Since implementing collaborative partnership protocols, we have achieved more significant scientific advancement through voluntary cooperation than we accomplished through decades of subject-based research. How is that possible? Asked Ambassador Tixfall from the Galactic Science Council. Beings who choose to share their abilities provide more complete information, teach more effectively, and develop innovations that isolated subjects never demonstrated. Danny looked around the park, which had been transformed into an informal learning campus, where beings from across the galaxy came to study not just dimensional perception, but collaborative approaches to communication, exploration, and community. Building Cosmos had become more than a teacher. He had become a model for how unique beings could contribute to galactic understanding while maintaining their autonomy and dignity. His voluntary sharing of dimensional abilities had facilitated breakthroughs in interspecies communication, space exploration, and community development that exceeded anything research protocols had achieved. The most significant discovery, Dr. Kelleron continued, is that collaborative learning produces innovations that coercive research cannot achieve. When beings share their gifts freely, they often develop new applications and combinations that emerge only through genuine partnership. Like the dimensional communication networks Cosmos helped establish between previously incompatible species, Danny added, or the exploration partnerships that have opened dimensional spaces we couldn't access through technology alone. But for Danny, the most meaningful transformation was personal, watching Cosmos evolve from a grieving, isolated being into a confident teacher who had found purpose in helping others discover their own potential for cross-dimensional understanding. Cosmos, how do you feel about the changes in your life since gaining autonomous status? Danny asked during one of their regular walks, which had continued even as Cosmos's role expanded far beyond pet care. Cosmos responded with holographic projections showing his journey from isolation and grief through companionship and healing to his current role as educator and facilitator. Images that conveyed not just personal satisfaction, but profound sense of purpose. You found meaning in helping others learn and grow, Danny interpreted. Cosmos projected additional images showing the relationships he had formed with students, colleagues, and friends throughout the galaxy, a network of connections that had grown from his original bond with Danny into a community of beings committed to collaborative discovery and mutual support. And you built the kind of community you lost when your original companion died. The holographic projections shifted to scenes of Danny's own transformation. From simple dog walker to galactic advocate for relationship-based approaches to scientific advancement and interspecies cooperation. Cosmos is pointing out that you found your purpose too, Yonder observed. Your pet care business evolved into something that benefits beings throughout the galaxy. Danny looked around the park at the diverse groups of beings learning dimensional perception, collaborative communication, and partnership-based problem-solving, all techniques that had emerged from his simple recognition that Cosmos deserved to be treated with care and respect rather than studied as property. I never imagined that walking dogs would lead to establishing galactic rights for sentient beings. But that's exactly what happened, Dr. Kelleron noted. Your insistence that Cosmos be treated as an individual worthy of companionship rather than as a research specimen created legal precedent that protects unique beings throughout galactic civilization. Cosmos projected images showing other beings who had benefited from the autonomy rights established through his case sentient crystals who chose to share geological knowledge, energy beings who facilitated power system innovations, and dimensional travelers who enabled exploration of previously inaccessible regions of space, all because you recognize that scientific discovery works better through friendship than through coercion. Yonder added. As their conversation continued, Danny reflected on how his career had evolved from providing pet care services to facilitating relationships that advanced galactic understanding while protecting individual rights and dignity. The most important lesson, Danny said, is that treating unique beings as partners rather than property doesn't just benefit those individuals. It benefits everyone by creating discoveries and innovations that emerge only through genuine collaboration. Cosmos's final holographic projection showed the ongoing expansion of collaborative learning throughout the galaxy, with beings from diverse species and dimensions working together on projects that combined their unique abilities in ways that serve both individual growth and community advancement. And it all started because someone cared enough to treat one isolated, grieving being as deserving of companionship rather than just study. Dr. Kelleron concluded as Danny prepared to continue his work facilitating relationships between unique beings and the communities that wanted to learn from them, he realized that his simple belief in providing proper care for every creature, regardless of how unusual they might be, had become the foundation for a galactic approach to discovery that celebrated both individual uniqueness and collaborative community. Sometimes the most profound transformations began with recognizing that every sentient being deserved to be treated with dignity, respect, and genuine care, regardless of what their uniqueness might teach others.